I'm Stephen Monteith. Welcome to my channel. Um, it's been couple of weeks since my last broadcast. I had a pretty bad cough. I don't know if it was COVID or not. I did not get myself tested. I didn't have any other symptoms, just a really bad cough that lingered for a long time. But it seems to mostly be gone now. Of course, I still have my general problems with speaking out loud for too long. It's so when I'm reading, I won't read the entire book aloud. I'll read whatever passages I feel like reading, make whatever comments I feel like making, and I'll try not to give myself too scratchy a throat. It's already starting. Anyway, the book I'm reading is Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It's the Barnes & Noble Classics edition. It comes with footnotes and endnotes that give a little more context for what's taking place in the book itself. Context about Mary Shelley's life and her influences and, what the world was like back then. I may reference those. We are on chapter 11 now. And if you haven't watched the previous videos, just to give you a brief update, Victor, a young man who's in his 20s, has already created the creature, who doesn't have a proper name yet. And after Victor created him while he was away at college, the creature disappeared, and Victor was sick for a while, and when he finally went back to his family, his younger brother was murdered, and a friend of his named Justine was put to death for the crime. But Victor is pretty convinced that it was the creature. Anyway, after all of that, Victor went into the mountains to try and clear his head, to try and think about what he could tell people. I mean, if you had created life like that, what would you tell people? So he's understandably confused and looking to figure out what to do at this point. And the creature actually finds him in the mountains and promises to tell him his story. To tell him what happened, from the time that Victor created him up till now. Victor, of course, believes that the creature is a killer and evil. So just remember, one more thing you have to remember. This whole book is being told as if Victor was telling somebody else about all of this at the end of his life. He meets someone, and he's telling that person about all these events in retrospect. So it's all still from Victor's perspective, but now we're going to get it from the creature's perspective. So we've got two layers of potentially unreliable narrators here. And that's where we start with chapter 11. It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my beginning. Remember, this is the creature talking. All the events of that period appear confused and indistinct. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me, and I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time. And it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between the operations of my various senses. It's a pretty weird perspective. It's like being born as an adult. Talks about it being dark and him getting up and walking around in the darkness, trying to find his way around, trying to made his way to the forest nearby. I felt cold and half frightened, as it were instinctively, finding myself so desolate. Before I had quitted your apartment, on a sensation of cold, I had covered myself with some clothes. But these were insufficient to secure me from the dews of night. I was a poor, helpless, miserable wretch. I knew and could distinguish nothing. But feeling pain invade me on all sides, I sat down and wept. It's a pretty wretched state to be in. First, talks about his senses becoming sharper, more clear. Talks about foraging for food and becoming quite a naturalist, it seems. Learning to tell the different plants and animals apart from each other. Finds a fire that apparently was made and then abandoned by some beggars. He finds a hut. He goes inside, and there's an old man there near a fire making breakfast. And the old man sees him. He's scared, and he runs away. Not unlike what Victor did when he first saw the creature, though he doesn't mention this. Next day he finds a village. Says that at one cottage the children shriek and one of the women fainted. And this brought the whole village out. Some fled, some attacked me, until grievously bruised by stones and many other kinds of missile weapons, I escaped to the open country and fearfully took refuge in a low hovel. This hovel joined a cottage of a neat and pleasant appearance, but after my late dearly bought experience, I dared not enter it. My place of refuge was constructed of wood, but so low that I could, with difficulty, sit upright in it. No wood, however, was placed on the earth which formed the floor, but it was dry, and although the wind entered it by innumerable chinks, I found it an agreeable asylum for the snow and rain. It's a pretty thoughtful creature. In the morning, he goes exploring around the cottage, finds a pigsty, tries to keep himself hidden. He's yet to have one good encounter with a human being up to this point. He sees a young girl walking around outside. finds a little hole in the wall where he can look into the cottage itself and keep an eye on the family that lives there. Talks about how the old man in the cottage takes up an instrument. It doesn't say what kind. It says that he began to play and to produce sounds sweeter than the voice of the thrush or the nightingale. It was a lovely sight, even to me, poor wretch, who had never beheld aught beautiful before. The silver hair and benevolent countenance of the aged cottager won my reverence, while the gentle manners of the girl enticed my love. He played a sweet mournful air, which I perceived drew tears from the eyes of his amiable companion, of which the old man took no notice until she sobbed audibly. He then pronounced a few sounds, and the fair creature, leaving her work, knelt at his feet. He raised her and smiled with such kindness and affection that I felt sensations of a peculiar and overpowering nature. They were a mixture of pain and pleasure, such as I had never before experienced, either from hunger or cold, warmth or food, and I withdrew from the window, unable to bear these emotions. Soon after this, the young man returned, bearing on his shoulders a load of wood. The girl met him at the door, helping to relieve him of his burden, and, taking some of the fuel into the cottage, placed it on the fire. Then she and the youth went apart in a nook of the cottage, and he showed her a large loaf and a piece of cheese. She seemed pleased, and went into the garden for some roots and plants, which she placed in water and then upon the fire. She afterwards continued her work, whilst the young man went into the garden, and appeared busily employed in digging and pulling up roots. It goes on for a little bit longer. Then, with the family preparing dinner and appearing to be sad about some things that the creature doesn't quite know about yet. He watches them for a while longer. And then they go to bed, and then he goes to bed. He gets into chapter 12, where well, I say he goes to bed. He doesn't actually have a bed, but he lays down on the ground and is not able to sleep because he's thinking so much about everything that he saw that day. Says he wants to join them, but too many people who have seen him have driven him away. He watches them the next day and he realizes that the old man is blind. If you've watched some of the older Frankenstein movies, and even Young Frankenstein, you'll probably have an image of the creature coming in and meeting with the old blind man. Says the old blind man spends most of his time playing the instrument or just sitting and thinking. Creature says that the two younger people are often walking apart and seem to be crying. He says, I saw no cause for their unhappiness, but I was deeply affected by it. If such lovely creatures were miserable, it was less strange that I, an imperfect and solitary being, should be wretched. Yet why were these gentle beings unhappy? They possessed a delightful house, for such it was in my eyes, and every luxury. They had a fire to warm them when chill, and delicious foods when hungry. They were dressed in excellent clothes, and still more they enjoyed one another's company and speech, interchanging each day looks of affection and kindness. What did their tears imply? Did they really express pain? I was at first unable to solve these questions, but perpetual attention and time explained to me many appearances which were at first enigmatic. A considerable period elapsed before I discovered one of the causes of the uneasiness of this amiable family. It was poverty, and they suffered that evil in a very distressing degree. Their nourishment consisted entirely of the vegetables of their garden and the milk of one cow, which gave very little during the winter when its masters could scarcely procure food to support it. They often, I believe, suffered the pangs of hunger very poignantly, especially the two younger cottagers, for several times they placed food before the old man when they reserved none for themselves. This trait of kindness moved me sensibly. I had been accustomed during the night to steal a part of their store for my own consumption, but when I found that in doing this I inflicted pain on the cottagers, I abstained and satisfied myself with berries, nuts, and roots, which I gathered from a neighboring wood. I discovered also another means through which I was enabled to assist their labors. I found that the youth spent a great part of each day in collecting wood for the family fire, and during the night I often took his tools, the use of which I quickly discovered, and brought home firing sufficient for the consumption of several days. I remember the first time that I did this, the young woman, when she opened the door in the morning, appeared greatly astonished on seeing a great pile of wood on the outside. She uttered some words in a loud voice, and the youth joined her, who also expressed surprise. I observed with pleasure that he did not go to the forest that day, but spent it in repairing the cottage and cultivating the garden. By degrees, I made a discovery of still greater moment. I found that these people possessed a method of communicating their experience and feelings to one another by articulate sounds. I perceived that the words they spoke sometimes produced pleasure or pain, smiles or sadness, in the minds and countenances of the hearers. This was indeed a godlike science, and I ardently desired to become acquainted with it. But I was baffled in every attempt I made for this purpose. Their pronunciation was quick, and the words they uttered, not having any apparent connection with visible objects, I was unable to discover any clue by which I could unravel the mystery of their reference. He goes to a considerable amount of effort teaching himself to speak and the meaning of words. He learns that the old man is usually called father, the young girl sister or Agatha, and the youth Felix brother or son. And keep in mind, he's narrating all this to Victor Frankenstein right now, so he's obviously learned quite a few more words in the time since. Says he spent the whole winter this way. Watching them and learning from them, being happy when they're happy, being sad when they're sad. Says that sometimes he sees other people come to the cottage and that their harsh manner only enhanced to me the superior accomplishments of my friends. The old man, I could perceive, often endeavored to encourage his children, to cast off their melancholy. Agatha always tried to stay upbeat, probably for her father's sake. But Felix was always the saddest of the group, and even to my unpracticed senses he appeared to have suffered more deeply than the others. In the midst of poverty and want, Felix carried with pleasure to his sister the first little white flower that peeped out from beneath the snowy ground. Early in the morning, before she had risen, he cleared away the snow that obstructed her path to the milk-house, drew water from the well, and brought the wood from the outhouse, where, to his perpetual astonishment, he found his store always replenished by an invisible hand. In the day, I believe, he worked sometimes for a neighboring farmer. Because he often went forth and did not return until dinner, he had brought no wood with him. At other times he worked in the garden, But as there was little to do in the frosty season, he read to the old man and Agatha. This reading had puzzled me extremely at first, but by degrees I discovered that he uttered many of the same sounds when he read as when he talked. I conjectured, therefore, that he found on the paper signs for speech which he understood. Mm-hmm. I ardently longed to comprehend these also, but how was that possible when I did not even understand the sounds for which they stood as signs? Although I eagerly longed to discover myself to the cottagers, I ought not to make the attempt until I had first become master of their language, which knowledge might enable me to make them overlook the deformity of my figure. For with this also the contrast perpetually presented to my eyes had made me acquainted. I had admired the perfect forms of my cottagers, their grace, beauty, and delicate complexions, but how was I terrified when I viewed myself in a transparent pool. At first I started back, unable to believe that it was indeed I who was reflected in the mirror. And when I became fully convinced that I was in reality the monster that I am, I was filled with the bitterest sensations of despondence and mortification. Alas, I did not yet entirely know the fatal effects of this miserable deformity. Talks about talks about spring coming on and the changes it brings. Says that he usually slept when the others were out and about, and that when they came back, he spent all his time watching them. And when they rested, he went into the woods and collected his own food and fuel. And when he returned, as he would clear their path from the snow, perform those offices that he had seen Felix do. And that he would observe how astonished they would react upon seeing the results of his labors, and how grateful they seemed. But he still wondered why Felix seemed so miserable, and why Agatha seemed so sad. He thought that he might have it in his power to restore happiness to them. He thought a bunch of times about how to show himself to them, to present himself, what they would be like if how they would react to him. That's the end of chapter 12. He promises a more moving part to his story in chapter 13, but I think we're going to stop right there for now. It's a hell of a first winter for this creature. Having watched a lot of Frankenstein movies and whatnot, it's easy to get a sense of a just a plain old dumb or even evil creature. Sometimes I would get the impression that if it had a human brain, the brain of a live person, that I mean, he clearly has the intelligence of a human adult. He's learning to distinguish sounds and sights and everything else now that his senses have caught up and everything. And he's teaching himself how to speak and everything else. He's clearly intelligent. But he also clearly has no memories of whoever his brain belonged to beforehand. It's an interesting dynamic. It's like it's a little bit like artificial intelligence stories, really. Although their creators tend to give them tend to stick around after they're born. Anyway, it's an interesting way to show what this creature was like right after Frankenstein brought him to life. He's very sympathetic right off the bat. I mean, even back in Mary Shelley's time, you would think that people would have the same opinion of him that Victor does. And it certainly seems in the chapters before this that the story is trying to steer you towards thinking that the creature is a monster, that he did kill William. We don't know yet whether he did or not, but we do know that that since Victor didn't stay around to teach the monster, that the monster had to learn everything by itself, and he certainly seems intelligent in doing so. So we'll get to chapter 13 later on. Thank you for watching. Be sure to read my own stories. You can see they're here on These are the first 3 Stefan Feld books. There are links to them in the description. You can watch them on all of my, or read them rather, on all e-readers. If you go on my website, you can find links to them, and you can find links to my podcast and my other social media. Be sure to leave a rating and a review on whatever you happen to read or listen to or watch. And I'll try and be back on a more regular basis from now on. Like I said, I've just gotten over being sick, and hopefully won't get sick again anytime soon. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you more later.